The research proposed a new diagnosis called terminal anorexia. I realized that there were real cases of people with eating disorders that had been given lethal medications to end their lives. And they were under the age of 40. They were really young.
What you found out is not that people are proposing to do this in future. It's that they're already giving death to people with eating disorders. They're already doing it. They seem to also think it's a positive step. It's just part of the treatment. I find that so shocking.
And all women, I should say. All of the cases we identified were women.
Hey Chelsea, why are we making a podcast about death?
Hi Fiona, good question. Two ladies talking about death. It's because we're worried women are not talking about these issues enough.
That's right, UK Parliament's debating laws on assisted dying, the results of campaigning all over the world for governments to take the pretty momentous step and offer death to their citizens. We really want you to join us as we learn why this is a huge issue for women. I guess I've always thought that assisted dying was none of my business. If people wanted assisted death, well, they should be allowed to choose that. I'm Fiona Mackenzie. I run a think tank called The Other Half, and I've done lots of work on criminal justice outcomes where the state has failed women. And what's made assisted dying my business is I'm really worried by the stories that come out of places like the Netherlands and Canada, and I want to make really sure that we don't see those kinds of abuses here in the UK. Chelsea, you are a fantastic researcher and you lead a charity supporting people with eating disorders. Why have you got involved in the assisted dying debate, and what have eating disorders got to do with assisted death?
Yeah, that's a great question, Fiona. If you'd told me a year ago that I would be I'd have a new friend and that we'd be chatting on a podcast about assisted death and eating disorders, I don't think I would have believed you. We're similar in that I think we both, or I can say for me, when I first heard about assisted dying, kind of been vaguely aware of it for many years, I was pretty much, if not in favor of it, at least fairly neutral around it. I remember watching a YouTube video actually about kind of a death party, just before someone was about to die and they brought all their friends. And I think instinctively, I thought, well, that seems like a really positive thing. If the person is in pain and they're suffering and they're dying already, it's inevitable, they're in the dying process, then being mindful and conscious about how one dies and maybe reducing suffering at the end of life is a positive thing. And I look back, so I just had no reason to question it and no reason to be uncertain about it. I certainly never thought it would have anything to do with eating disorders. And I feel almost a bit ashamed saying this, but I don't think I really dug into the evidence and data on it until it started affecting people in our community. As you said, I run a charity that supports people with eating disorders. And I should also mention I'm a researcher, and most of my work for pretty much my whole career had nothing to do with death. It was focused really on looking at treatments for eating disorders, and particularly for people with eating disorders that aren't being served by the medical model, that are often labeled untreatable or treatment resistant. And there was a paper that was published in 2022, and I always kind of keep an eye on the research, that proposed a new diagnosis called terminal anorexia. And I heard about it and I kind of thought, oh, wow, that's, ridiculous. What are they going to come up with now? Untreatable, treatment resistant, terminal. It wasn't until about a year later that I actually read it, and I realized that they were real cases of people with eating disorders that had been given lethal medications to end their lives. And they were under the age of 40. They were really young. They had decades of life ahead of them. And it shocked me, and it really broke my heart that, that the people that I would think would be responsible for helping them to get better and to recover were really, it's a mental illness, assisting in their death, some people would say assisting in their suicide. So that got me really concerned. And we'll talk about it, in future episodes. But being a researcher, I looked at the literature and saw, oh my gosh, this is the only study on it. If there's no research on this. Is this happening in other countries? Is this just an isolated case And together with my colleague, I ended up doing a big study and finding that it's not an isolated practice and it's actually happening in many countries.
Chelsea, this, if I can pause there, you, as you say, like eating disorder recovery is about life, and what you found out is not that people are proposing to do this in future. It's that they're already giving death to people with eating disorders all over the world where assisted dying is lawful. So it's not that they're asking for permission to do this, they're already doing it, and they seem to also think it's a positive step. It's just part of the treatment model. I find that so shocking.
Yeah, you and me both. I would say maybe not all over the world, but in multiple countries and in multiple U.S. states. I've learned since that assisted dying is legal in about 33, as we're recording this podcast, 33 jurisdictions worldwide, and that includes 10 U.S. states, so really just over 20 countries. So it is a somewhat, isolated practice, and it's generally in Western countries, but of those countries and of those jurisdictions, we've confirmed that there were cases in Belgium, there were cases in the Netherlands, and I think most shockingly to those of us who live in the UK, also in 3 U.S. states. And these are states where assisted death is only legal for terminal illness. So you have a situation where perhaps the framers of the law and the people campaigning for the law, they said, well, we only want to just do this for terminal illness. But what some physicians did is they, in order to kind of fit eating disorders through the terminal illness criteria, just started calling eating disorders terminal. And that did result in the deaths of real women. And all women, I should say. All of the cases we identified were women.
What's so staggering about this is that we're not finding out about what's happening to women with eating disorders who are being given death because it's a proposal, it's something that's already happening. And I only know about it because you wrote your paper, and you know about it because a doctor who was doing this, who was providing death to her eating disorder patients, decided to write about it in a paper. And so it's not that there's some kind of inbuilt mechanism that picks this up and holds the whole thing to account. It's basically these abuses are happening and we can't tell until after they've happened, and we can only tell if somebody chooses to speak out.
Yeah, I think what was so shocking to me when we did this study is that, so we've confirmed cases in 3 U.S. states, but those cases were not listed in the public data. So to really draw an underline over what you just said, we wouldn't know that they had occurred if a physician hadn't decided to write a paper about it. I went to the oversight agencies and I said, why are these deaths not listed in your public reports? And they said, oh, those are in the, quote, other illnesses category. So essentially people with anorexia who essentially, when a physician said, I'm prescribing this medication for a person with anorexia. We've also seen it for terminal malnutrition. Instead of including that, cancer, stroke, all of the lists, there's this category at the end of the report that says other illnesses. And anorexia was in that category. So the reporting is really, there's a lack of transparency in the reporting. And I would say even in the Netherlands, that does the best reporting on this, most of the data is in a black box. As you said, the victims are no longer alive to speak about it. So it's a real concern. And I guess I'd mentioned that whole journey of looking at those cases and digging into the data to kind of come full circle, I realized that there were issues here that I wasn't aware of. That safeguards that sounded really rigorous, terminal illness, voluntary request, mental capacity, were not actually in clinical practice working that well. And then I realized, oh my gosh, this isn't just affecting the eating disorder community. That's why I say I was a bit ashamed at the beginning. This is affecting disabled people. This is affecting women from marginalized communities. This is affecting people who can't get housing support. This is a really, really, really big issue.
The fact that the the law in the US is used as the model for the law here in the UK that's being discussed should give us real pause, because that law in the US is leading to women with eating disorders being killed through this process, and that seems to be an abominable outcome that we need to never have happen here, I think. And there's a silence on this issue which is really surprising. Esther Ranson was kicked off the push for law here in the UK in the last year or so. She wants assisted death to be offered to people like her, and I think that's one part of the question. The other part is what happens to the rest of society, though, and that's the thing we're not talking about. Is if this becomes law, and it could become law this year in the UK, what happens to vulnerable people? What happens to those people on the margins who we don't see? And how on earth are we going to find out about it? And what are we going to do? How will we respond as a society? Because as you say, these people are going to be dead. And I think that women, from both of our work, women seem to be particularly vulnerable in assisted dying to abuses. So men are obviously vulnerable too, but it's one area where women and men seem to be very specifically different in their vulnerabilities. And we want to talk about this in this podcast and then future episodes, just what that looks like for women, and why feminists and civil society and lawyers and public bodies need to be all over this, because as we will say over and over again, you get this wrong, people are dead and you can't reverse that. There's no going back from that.
I've noticed that the way the conversation's happening here in the UK where we live, the debate is almost framed as either you are progressive and you're for choice and autonomy and women having control over their bodies and all of that, or if you're not for this bill, you are probably religious, probably conservative, you're about the state controlling bodies. And I think I was struck by that, because I don't fit into that mold. I actually think of this as a very progressive issue, that being concerned about the risk to vulnerable and marginalized communities and people who are the most likely to be harmed by this law is a very progressive issue. And I think we wanted to start to carve out that conversation for people that maybe think like you and I do.
It seems to be a very sort of 20th century idea that it's all part of a progressive menu of choice that people should be offered, and that there's no impact on anyone else. You don't have to think about anyone else in society. And we have much better understanding now of things like domestic abuse and the impact that abusers can have on their victims, and how bad people will exploit systems of the state for their own ends, but lots of that understanding is really modern and really recent, and I think I think even if you are for assisted dying, for those who want it, you need to be all over this, because what we really don't want is for this to unfold. Nobody wants this to unfold and to start harming vulnerable people. Harming the words are not enough. Start killing vulnerable people who wouldn't otherwise have sought death. So I think we want to talk a bit more about some of the very specific issues that women see. One of the things I wanted to look at was from my previous work on homicide outcomes for women. I knew that there were men claiming that the women had asked him to kill her in what's called a mercy killing or a failed suicide pact, and these men were being prosecuted and it was getting to the courts. And I quickly found more than 100 so-called mercy killings of people, and they're really relevant to the debate on this, because they tell us what the kind of things that abusers get up to when they think there's an out, but they also tell us something about assisted dying as a campaign, because these mercy killings have been used by assisted dying campaigners for decades as showing that these men, and it should be clear it's overwhelmingly men who do it, that these people, these killers, should be given leniency, and also that they show a need for assisted death, so that if we had assisted dying, these people would not have needed to kind of kill their family members. And the perception seemed to be that these were people being, helped on their way in the final throes of dying by family members, and that those family members were being unfairly prosecuted by the state. But what I found was so, it was genuinely shocking, and I'm not really that shockable with this kind of thing anymore, but it was overwhelmingly men, so these are the cases that are prosecuted, overwhelmingly men, so 88% of them were men killing women, mostly their wives, sometimes their daughters or their mothers, using terrible violence to do that, with overkill frequent. And the men were repeatedly being given leniency by the courts. So the men were being prosecuted for murder, but allowed to plead guilty to manslaughter by diminished responsibility and given a suspended sentence. The traditional penalty for euthanasia, that was a quote from a 1980s media piece. And the problem we have is that these men are convincing. They are convincing judges to say this was an act of love, an act of mercy. They're often kind of ex-police officers or vets, or they're respectable fellows. And we have to ask ourselves, how will these homicidal men behave when the state is instead offering lawful death, a route for people to die in a way that is, as we're hearing, is secret, is allowed, and is perhaps viewed as positive and progressive? Will we be able to find these men and prevent harms to women?
I'm struck even, thinking about, you've done such incredible work around this and exposing these narratives and, in the men, but also just the narrative, the social narrative that goes along with those cases, the devaluation of some women's lives. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but in many of these cases, we're talking about disabled women, we're talking about women with chronic illnesses, and we're talking about a particular group of women who, in court cases, we're saying, well, she's better off dead. We put her out of her pain and suffering. And I mean, is she better off for who? Better off for for the woman or the man? And it links up with another vulnerability. We don't think of assisted death as a women's issue, but the data coming out of Europe, particularly in Belgium and the Netherlands, in these countries, they have expanded the laws so far that it is now legal on the basis of a psychiatric condition alone or a mental disorder alone. And, unsurprisingly to maybe someone like you or me, women are being killed at a much higher rate than men. So the researchers have started calling psychiatric euthanasia the canary in the coal mine. The estimates right now is that between 69 and 77% of women who die by euthanasia for psychiatric reasons or mental reasons related to mental disorders are women. So there's a real gender gap here that we're not talking about. And that's the same actually in Canada. So in Canada, Track 2 MAID, which is, available to someone with a non-terminal illness, 61% are women. So we're seeing women being killed at much higher rates. And I think that has to do with how we value women's lives.
Yeah, and it's women, as you say, women seem particularly vulnerable to seeking suicide by state. So where there is a sort of method of suicide offered, the women seem particularly vulnerable to that. And that is also true if you look at criminal assisted death, where that's been offered in the US, sort of back in the, I think, 80s or 90s, and actually here in the UK, where one of the big campaign groups representatives were offering private euthanasia, and overwhelmingly the people who were dying were women. And we need to really understand that, because as you say, when we look at the criminal justice outcomes, these men, perhaps up to sort of a man every month who kills a woman in a so-called mercy killing, these women are disabled, elderly, infirm, they are vulnerable, and they are not the perfect picture of women in the final throes of terminal illness making a sustained, voluntary and well understood request for assisted death. But yet these men are managing to persuade everyone that it was what she wanted. There's something really unnerving about that, and I think that the assisted dying campaigns haven't reckoned with those malevolent actors in society. I mean, shockingly, actually, 2 of the men who it was very widely reported had been violent to female partners. One man had been violent to his wife and who then killed her, and one man who had been violent and actually went to prison for GBH on his subsequent partner. 2 of those men who killed women were public supported by assisted dying campaigners as being the kinds of fellows who show that we need assisted death and we need leniency. And my real worry is that the campaign here has been going for such a long time that it hasn't caught up with modern understanding of how abusers will take advantage of freedom in the law.
Yeah, and I think it brings us to some of the safeguards that are being proposed. You see this internationally, but it's really a big part of the conversation in the UK right now because a bill is being considered. One of the big things that has been part of the conversation is the question of coercion. So when people have spoken out against it, they've said, well, if we legalize it, can we really assess for coercion? So the bill says, this would only be available to someone making a voluntary, non-coerced choice. And that sounds good. That sounds, I think safeguards often sound really good on paper. We could agree maybe in principle. Some people will say, okay, in principle, I think that sounds good. But then when you look at, well, how would that work in practice? How would you assess whether a person is coerced? That then it becomes. I feel like it's like trying to hold sand. It just sort of crumbles in your hand. You realize, oh, we're asking a physician to assess whether a woman has been coerced. Interesting. We don't normally ask physicians to make those assessments, but okay, I give you that. Wait a minute, we're asking them to do that in the NHS, which is overstretched. I hardly get 10 minutes with my doctor if I'm lucky, and we want this physician to sort out, is this person potentially being influenced by intimate partner violence? Are they feeling even internalized pressure from their family because they're worried there won't be any inheritance left for their grandchildren? Are they depressed? Are they feeling a sense of, I'm a burden to everyone around me and it would be better that I'm not here? How are we going to really assess that in practice?
Absolutely. And actually, are we going to assess that at all? I think that's even if we wanted to, something like being a burden on your family is actually viewed as a legitimate reason for seeking assisted dying by lots of people who campaign for it. Now, I personally completely disagree with that. I think that's awful. But you will see it again and again in the lawful systems that we are trying to replicate in the proposed bill in the UK. In these systems overbroad, being a burden is a very sizable minority of the reason that people are given assisted death. So actually, maybe sort of 30-40% of people in places like Australia, Canada and Oregon are saying, I feel like a burden on my family and friends.
There's immense vulnerability in those moments. And I wonder if perhaps some people just haven't really empathized with those moments. Maybe they go, well, maybe they are a burden to their family. But can you think about moments in your life where you've wondered, well, maybe it would be better if I wasn't in this family, or I wasn't in this community. Those are really vulnerable moments. And I think the society that I want to live in is one where there are protections for those people in those moments, where we don't hand someone a lethal medication in their most despairing moments.
Yeah, that's it. I think that, almost supporting people into suicidality is a really odd idea, because all of the suicide prevention messages we hear are around intervening, and almost members of the public should try and intervene when people are suicidal because we are so committed as a society to preventing this. But yet, if it's somebody with a terminal illness, actually suicidality is something we should be supportive of and be almost facilitating. That seems really wrong to me. But you're so right. These idea of safeguards. Kim Leadbeater, who is the MP who's proposed this bill, says that we will have the strongest safeguards in the world here in the UK. But we can look at what's happening elsewhere to see what really, really works and what doesn't. And the issue we have here is, as you say, we have overstretched NHS doctors who are not in any way normally trained in domestic abuse. One of the fantastic domestic abuse charities is working with Macmillan Cancer Care just now to do a new project where they train cancer care physicians in spotting domestic abuse, because when somebody gets a terminal diagnosis or a big diagnosis, very often abuse can escalate. And one of the things that abusers will do is they will coerce the victim into or away from particular treatment choices. How will these abusers behave when death is one of the treatment choices? You know, what does that look like, and how will a doctor find out? And the data point I can give you is we have all these men who are killing women who do not want to die, who aren't terminally ill, but they are repeatedly given mercy themselves by the courts. They are let free. And the thing I find, God, I find it so shocking. In the UK, we run this really forensic process. So you have court case, police investigation, coroner, press, which allows someone like me to come along and say, actually, there's a pattern here that we're not spotting. There's something else happening, a different story. We won't have that in these private assisted dying regimes. But what we also do is when someone dies in a domestic homicide, we do this post-death forensic review where friends and family are interviewed, and there's the court case papers are gone through to try and find evidence of domestic abuse. And even though these are de facto domestic homicides, what we'd always say is the sort of the escalation of a pattern of control. They almost never find any evidence of domestic abuse. So even with that level of huge intrusive forensic reporting by the state, we don't find evidence of domestic abuse in mercy killings. And that should really worry us, because these men will still exist, after this law is passed. But we need to be sure that we'll find them. And I don't think we know how to do that right now. Should we talk more about some of the safeguards? I think we've touched on this question of voluntarily and coercion, but we're going to have judicial safeguards here in the UK, which will be, an unusual step. Normally, I think 2 doctors are asked to sign off on the decision. That seems to be kind of fairly commonly adopted around the world. But we're going to have a judge reviewing this. I mean, Chelsea, is that going to be an additional level of safeguard, do you think?
I'm immensely skeptical about the judicial safeguard being presented as one of the tightest safeguards in the world. But really, don't listen to me. Listen to the retired judges that have written excellent articles on this, who are also immensely skeptical. My personal worry, having been privy to some of the court of protection cases around eating disorders, is that when young women mostly are brought to courts and their treatment professionals say, we've done all we can, she's untreatable, she's treatment resistant, there's nothing more we can do. In fact, we've actually seen court cases here in the UK where the patient has been referred to as in the terminal stage of her illness. We're talking about patients in their 20s. I've seen another case where she was referred to as being in the pre-death stage. And again, we're talking about just past adolescence. Highly treatable young women. But what happens there when a physician or 2 physicians presents that information and says she's untreatable, she's terminal, often what happens is the judge trusts the physician's opinion. It's a rubber stamping process. And, I can't judge the judge for doing that. That is, physicians carry authority, but I know in our sector, there is a very small but very vocal minority of physicians who believe that eating disorders can be terminal. And I've said this before, it only takes 2 physicians in this bill to maintain a assisted death program for eating disorders, and a judge rubber stamping it.
It's a real worry, and as I say, it's hard to see what the judges will offer. Well, let's talk about some more of the safeguards. We've talked a little bit about the doctors. We've talked a bit about the fact that you need to be, it needs to be a persistent, voluntary, settled and informed wish to end your own life. And we've talked about the judges.
Could Could we just really pause there on settled and informed wish? Because that really is an interesting one. There's I see this in other countries, but we're not supposed to call it assisted suicide. We're supposed to call it assisted death. I wonder, how does one determine whether it is an informed and a settled wish to end one's life versus a person who's feeling suicidal, who's depressed, who's feeling like a burden? That is an almost impossible assessment to make. Where is the line between suicide and settled, informed wish to die? I don't think that has been bared out, and I would be really curious at how a physician would figure that out. The other piece is that there's no requirement that patients be screened for mental disorders, for psychiatric issues. So, there's nothing that would prevent somebody who's depressed and suicidal, who might also have a terminal illness or have been given a 6-month prognosis, who needs suicide prevention, who needs care, who needs psychiatric support, to be helped in their own suicide, which is a real worry.
It's so worrying, and as you say, there's no requirement for you to know the doctor. So I mean, we like to imagine that this will be your family GP you've known for 20 years, but it could actually just be somebody online, and we've seen that in Canada in particular. You get these mega providers who will just give death to anyone who gets in touch with them. That if you have only a couple of doctors who believe that it is the progressive thing to do to offer assisted death to, in inverted commas, terminally ill anorexia patients, you could have that happening, and it just feels like the slippery slope has begun. Again, something that you're supposed to not mention in the sophisticated arguments around assisted death. You're supposed to say there's no such thing as a slippery slope. Of course, we would never be like Canada or the Netherlands, but it seems that people are very poor at redrawing boundaries once we remove that hard prohibition that killing people is wrong. Obviously the hardest prohibition I would try and maintain, which is that killing women is wrong. Killing women is always wrong. And people seem to really struggle, once this becomes lawful, to reassert a boundary in a different place. I just think this is so worrying. We need to go and talk to everyone we can on this. We're going to go and talk to the Canadians, so the incredible women who are working in the Canadian system and trying to prevent the really monstrous outcomes we hear about. A disabled woman, ex-Paralympian, being offered euthanasia instead of a ramp for her home. I mean, these are terrifying, and we want to know from them, what do we need to worry about here in the UK if we never want to be like Canada? Yeah,
I'm really looking forward to the conversations we have coming up. We're going to talk to some physicians and some researchers, some of whom have looked at this specifically in eating disorders, and some of whom are looking at this more broadly around the world with people in mental distress, looking at the impact on disabled people. And then we also want to talk to some brilliant speakers here in the UK who are trying to untangle this bill a bit. And also, I should say, if you're on the fence, or if you're going, I don't know, there's some things you said in this podcast I completely disagree with, we hope you'll still come on this journey with us, because my mind has changed on this issue, and it may change again. And I think that it's something that we all have a duty to our fellow human beings to at least understand and go into this with eyes wide open.